Hey everybody, good to see you here today. We are picking up right where we left off in class yesterday. So we are looking to finish up our note sheet here today. We take a look over. Oh, it's not going to load because my internet's crazy. Um, but it's the same note sheet that we had yesterday. So find the Battle of Yorktown, and that is where we are picking up. All right, so we talked about yesterday how at the Battle of Yorktown, this was this unexpected event. And with that, we had George Washington thinking he was going to head his way up to Washington, D.C. here, right? And instead, he gets word that down here in Yorktown, there's a massive bunch of British soldiers waiting to get resupplied. And so Washington's going to turn around his troops, right, along with Rochambeau, and they're going to head their way down. Lafayette, hearing word too, he's going to make his way east across Virginia, and they're going to have them cornered in right here, right? And the land is cut off. So now basically they're stuck in the bay. About that time then, we have the French fleet. De Grassy's French fleet is going to come up from the south, right? And De Barras's fleet is coming down with big giant guns on their ships from the north to cut them off here. These guys are coming in right at the end of August. Then, about a week too late, we got the British fleet coming in. But by that point, the entire British fleet, or British army, is completely surrounded by the Americans. And so the point really here is at this point is the British have to decide, are they going to try and fight their way out of this? Or are they going to surrender? And if they surrender, then they have to decide, are they going to resupply and bring more troops in to keep this war going? All of those choices are just not going to work for Parliament. So they end up surrendering, and they end up deciding that this will be a final surrender, that the war is over. They're not going to resupply their troops. They're not going to send thousands of troops over to end this thing. So they're going to end this thing once and for all. The surrender itself is kind of a debacle. Cornwallis, the general of the British military in that area at the time, really did not respect George Washington in any way, shape, or form, and so therefore refused to do that official surrender of handing his sword over to George Washington. He had a lower officer do it. All right, so we'll pause right now. We're going to watch this video here. That's going to take us through what that surrender was kind of like. Right, I'm having internet issues. Let's try this again.
Cornwallis seeks honorable terms, which Washington rejects. He will give the British the same treatment they gave the Americans a year earlier at Charleston. Colors surrendered, and Cornwallis's men, prisoners. The British commander has no choice but to accept or face further bloodshed. At 2 p.m. on October 19, 1781, the British march from the ruined remains of Yorktown. They stack their weapons and surrender their flag. Lord Cornwallis claims illness, leaving the formal surrender to Brigadier General Charles O'Hara. O'Hara attempts to surrender to Rochambeau, who directs him to General Washington. Washington, in turn, has O'Hara surrender to his second-in-command, General Benjamin Lincoln, who had been forced to ignobly surrender a year before at Charleston. With Cornwallis's sick and wounded, more than 8,000 prisoners are counted at Yorktown, along with over 200 cannon, 8,000 muskets, and 2,000 swords. The British suffer 556 killed, wounded, or missing. The Allies, 389, nearly two-thirds of which were French. That evening, Washington notifies Congress, writing simply that a reduction of the British Army under the command of Lord Cornwallis is most happily effected. The evening of October 22nd, they issue a decree for a day and night of celebration. When Lord North, the British Prime Minister, learns of the defeat a month later, he blurts, "Oh God, it is all over." And while King George III continues to ask for further military actions, the war is essentially over. The defeat at Yorktown and the mounting costs of the war saps British public support for continued action. In April 1782, the British Parliament seeks out the American ministry in France to begin negotiations. 18 months later, the Treaty of Paris is ratified by Congress, bringing about the end of America's war for independence and the beginning of a new nation. With the war over, General Washington shocked the world in December 1783 by resigning his commission as Commander-in-Chief. Walking away from such a powerful position prompted King George III to call him the greatest character of his age. But his retirement from public service would be short-lived. By 1787, he was elected president of the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia. 2 years later, he would become the first president of the United States.
All right. That kind of wraps it up for us there, and does a good job of kind of summarizing how the last little bit went. At the end of the war, then, we see some major consequences happen overall with the war itself. This is 8 years of war, and so there's going to be a lot of sacrifice that happens in these 8 years. I think we like to remember the Revolution as kind of this civilized war where it really wasn't that gruesome or terrible. And we kind of sugarcoat, because we don't have pictures or video, we can kind of sugarcoat just how difficult it was for these men. But looking statistically, the American Revolution was one of the most destructive wars in our history. It had a higher death rate percentage-wise than any other war that we've had. And taking a look at the battlefield deaths and the number that died from disease and then the number that died as prisoners, if you take it in percentage with population, it's a crazy number. It would be millions in today's numbers. And so there was a lot of sacrifice that went into these 8 years that I think is important for us to look at and important for us to remember going forward here. That Treaty of Paris that they mentioned in the video was signed a couple of years later. They went over to France to take care of that. This painting is really the only kind of image we have of what that might have looked like. And it was never fully finished. How this works is, one side would sit for the painting, right, and then the other side would sit. So we have our founding fathers here sitting for that signing, and then, of course, the British, they never came and did it. The British delegation refused to do that. But what we get out of the Treaty of Paris is kind of twofold here. One, we get recognized as an independent nation, officially recognized as a government. And two, we get a ton more land. We get land all the way from the Atlantic Ocean up to the Mississippi River. So that more than doubles the space that we have. It's going to be one of the issues we have to deal with, is how do we protect this? How do we make this our own? And it'll be a process, to say the least. We always like to tie in Wisconsin a little bit here, and so it's a little bit harder with the American Revolution because there weren't many white settlers in this area at this time, still primarily covered by territories of Native American tribes. But as far as Revolutionary War vets, there are about 40 vets buried in Wisconsin here today. So, of course, these would be people that moved here after the war. This man right here, our closest to here in Milton, is in Oregon. And there are some, and a couple, I think, in Whitewater as well. But this man here, his name was Nathaniel Ames. He was 16 years old. When he enlisted, he fought under General Washington himself. After the war, eventually made his way this direction, and today he's buried in Oregon. And so after the war wraps up, we've talked about a lot of this stuff in between, right? So the war ends, they're still under the Articles of Confederation. They really don't want a powerful government, but they realize that they can't continue under the Articles. It's not going to work. And so that Constitutional Convention is had. George Washington kind of leads that thing, and it is in that moment that they decide to write this new Constitution. And that's where we get our three branches and our separation of power with our checks and balances and the president and the Constitution we have today. This is the same Constitution where they had that divide between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. Who wants, so that powerful federal government versus powerful state government, right? And along with that, one of the arguments was that insistence that they add those Bill of Rights right away in order for that to be ratified. So if we fast forward here a couple of decades, 30 years or so into this, America is starting to establish itself. If you look at the map of the U.S. in 1812, you can see that we have already expanded our territory. Under our third president, Thomas Jefferson, we added the Louisiana Territory. We were able to buy that back from France. We have more states that have been added to the Union. Right? We have additional, more organized territory showing up here as well. And so with all of this, America continues to grow. And with that growth, things aren't always going to go as easily as we want them to. So going into 1812, we still had some major struggles that we're trying to figure out as a new nation. One of that actually had to be were our old partners and then our arch enemy, the British. The British continue to be a burden for the new American government, even though they recognize our independence. One thing they're doing is they're setting up trade restrictions on us. They're making it really, really difficult for us to get a fair trade deal, and it's hurting our economy. Another thing that the British are doing is they are enforcing something called impressment on our soldiers. We had a small navy at that point, and what that means is that the British would board our ships, claim that our sailors were actually British, and then just take them and arrest them and take them into their military, literally just kidnap them. It's called impressment. And that, of course, is not okay. And while people knew that they were doing it, we were having a hard time figuring out what to do about it. Another thing happening that the British are kind of underlying here is Native American resistance, especially in this territory out here, this unsettled territory. As more and more people are moving west, they're moving into these Native American lands. They're moving into their territory where they live. And so therefore, naturally, there's going to be some scuffle. About this time period, there is a pretty big Native American rebellion happening as they're trying to legit fight against some of these colonists as they're trying to hang on to their land. And so a lot of that resistance was led by a man named Tecumseh, and he was able to, in a way that no one else up to him had been able to, is join multiple tribes together in this joint effort to win over the Native Americans and to work together to basically kick out the Americans and keep their lands as they could. Now, the British are connected to this because they were found to be supplying these guys with weapons and with supplies. So again, undermining our independence by doing so. A fourth way that British were undermining our independence was by still occupying fronts in the West. So again, we had all this territory. This used to be a British territory. It's not very populated by white Americans at this point. And so literally there are British forts where the British military just never left. They're still hanging out there 30 years later. And again, it's one of those things where we knew this was going on, but we didn't quite know what to do about it. And so the reality was, though, until we dealt with these issues with Britain, right, we were never going to be fully independent of them. All right. So all of this is going to lead to the War of 1812. The war breaks out early. It is a declared war, but it is not a popular war on all fronts. It is definitely basically divided by political party. Right? One party, the Democratic Republicans, used to be the anti-Feds. They want this war. They are frustrated with Britain, and they tend to have more ties to France. The Federalists, they do not want this war. They do not want they don't want to disrupt the economy, and so therefore they do not want to go to war here. The first couple of years of war don't go great, right? And the British really start dominating us, kind of like the early years of the Revolution. It really gets to a very, very low point here when in 1814, as after a couple of years of fighting again, they burn Washington to the ground. So they're going to come in and basically James Madison, the president at the time, he's going to like flee the town that day as these guys are coming in. Dolly Madison is going to be one of the last people to leave the White House. They're going to burn you can see them burning here. They're burning the White House. They're going to burn the U.S. Capitol. They're going to go in and they're going to burn up all sorts of documents, like primary source type documents that we had saved. Dolly Madison is credited for, well, she didn't do it. She ordered a slave to do it, but cutting out a very famous painting of George Washington. George Washington had died by this point, and literally rolling it up and running out the door as the British are coming in. So we're going to pause. We're going to watch this video right here that'll take you through this burning of Washington, D.C. It's a crazy, crazy story.
We're here overlooking Washington, D.C., which in 1814 was still a very young city. It had only been the capital for 14 years. The British decided to attack it in the War of 1812 after Napoleon was defeated in Europe in 1814. The British redeployed troops and ships that had been used in fighting Napoleon to raid the American coast. They wanted to retaliate for damage done to Canadian cities by Americans in the Great Lakes region. They were hoping that they could draw troops away from the British colony of Canada, and they wanted to create sectional tension and hurt the morale and the will to fight of the American people. They picked Baltimore and D.C. to begin with, and D.C. in particular, because they recognized that it was poorly defended and that it would be such an embarrassment to the U.S. government. They landed troops in Maryland in August of 1814, therefore, and quickly defeated American militiamen and sailors at the Battle of Bladensburg and marched into the city. The government was forced to flee. President Madison fled into Virginia, and First Lady Dolly Madison famously oversaw the removal of a lot of artifacts from the White House to save them from being destroyed by the British, most famously a portrait of George Washington. The U.S. Navy, to keep their supplies from falling into British hands, set the Navy Yard on fire, including two basically brand new warships that were not quite ready to sail. And when the British entered the city, they continued the destruction. Admiral George Cockburn oversaw the burning of Washington, and he was so proud of it that he actually had it painted as the background of his portrait later. But he did spare most of the civilian buildings and had his troops burn the government buildings. So they burned the White House, the Capitol, and buildings like the Treasury, but not private residences. They did interestingly spare the Patent Office when the head of the Patent Office convinced the British leaders that the items inside it were private property, and that all of the inventions and ideas there would be a loss to humanity and human progress if they were destroyed. But still, the fires were visible for 40 miles around. It wasn't until the next day when a huge storm came through that the fires were put out, but the storm was so windy that it spawned a tornado, and many private buildings that had been spared by the British were damaged themselves. This whole time there was also rampant looting, and so even private citizens didn't get off scot-free from the burning. This is arguably America's darkest hour. It was a huge embarrassment to the government and to President Madison. The Secretary of War had to resign. But the British left almost immediately because they never planned to hold the city to begin with, and it became clear as they moved towards Baltimore that it was not as much of a success as they'd hoped for. For one thing, the delay in attacking Washington, and especially the delay caused by the raid on nearby Alexandria, delayed the British in reaching Baltimore and gave the people of Baltimore time to better defend themselves. This is part of why the British were defeated at the Battle of Fort McHenry, which became the inspiration for the Star-Spangled Banner, our national anthem. The government also was pretty quickly able to move back into the city, and Congress actually met in the patent office since it was one of the only government buildings left. The president was able to move back into the White House in 1817, and the Library of Congress, which had been burned when the Capitol burned down, was replenished when Congress spent money to buy Thomas Jefferson's private library since he was deeply in debt, which became the foundation of the modern Library of Congress. Ultimately, then, the burning of Washington was not as much of a failure as it might seem at first. It was a huge embarrassment to begin with, but American victories at Baltimore and Plattsburgh, New York, helped salvage morale, and it didn't really do anything to draw troops away from Canada like the British had hoped. Most importantly, the burning of Washington demonstrated that the young republic, which the whole world had seen as a fragile institution, could survive war with a major power and even military disaster without losing the democratic principles that it stood for.
All right. Ooh, let's get out of here. All right. How do I get out of here? Here we go. All right. So with the burning of Washington, they talked about that Dolly Madison painting that she saved. And there it is, still hangs with the other presidential portraits throughout the White House today. It is still there, thanks to her and her quick thoughts. They also mentioned the Battle of Fort McHenry. This is another turning point. Again, we're talking through these wars at really just points that influence our history more than anything instead of specific battles. The Battle of Fort McHenry, right outside of Boston, Maryland. You can still see it there today. That's an image of it, what's there today. The biggest thing about this battle isn't necessarily the battle itself, but what happens after. This man right here, his name is Francis Scott Key. He actually writes a poem. He titles it The Star-Spangled Banner. All right, later, they're going to add it to music, and it becomes the national anthem that we have today. So we'll pause, we'll watch this too. I think this is kind of a cool story to kind of know where our national anthem comes from. All right. So that big flag, they still have a big giant flag there today, flying it high. Kind of a tribute to that time for sure. All right. So as you can see, when we talk about the War of 1812, it isn't so much the battles themselves. In the end, I mean, we can get into the details, but I'm just going to say in the end, we win. The British basically realize that it's not, after almost 3 years of fighting, it's just not worth the fight anymore. And so they end up signing the Treaty of Ghent. It's kind of this anticlimactic ending here. But kind of one exclamation point on the end of this war actually happens 2 weeks after that peace treaty is signed. And in this, the battle itself is an interesting battle. It's kind of a crazy story. But really what we get out of this is this guy right here, right? Because his name's Andrew Jackson. And he is a man that kind of came from nothing, was a boy during the Revolution era, raised by a single mom. He was taken a prisoner of war as a kid by the British and treated pretty terribly. His brother died as a result of it. He's going to kind of scratch his way up and eventually enter the military here. And it's going to be this Battle of New Orleans that makes Andrew Jackson a household name in America. Eventually, he's going to be able to ride that fame all the way into the White House, as he does 8 years as the President of the United States. And he's going to be a president unlike any that we have ever had before. And so we'll get to his story and that piece of his story a little bit later. But for now, we'll watch this last video here today that'll take us into how the Battle of New Orleans played out for him.
The War of 1812 is a story as much about a nation in conflict with itself as it is a clash of countries. Early 19th century America is a loose association of scattered states, bordered by a vast wilderness to the west and miles of ocean to its east. Isolated communities are surrounded by uncharted and hostile territory. Americans are intertwined by one thread: shipping. On January 7th, 1815, after weeks of holding off the British invaders, Andrew Jackson's ragtag army of 4,000 men lie in wait. At any moment, the inevitable attack will begin. The Battle of New Orleans will be the climactic showdown of the War of 1812.
As the evening of January 7th appears, the men behind Line Jackson know that an attack is imminent. They can hear the sounds directly in front of them, and yet their morale is extremely high because in their mind, they have beaten the British twice. They feel themselves almost invincible, each man relying upon that piece of wall that he himself has constructed. And it is their morale, coupled with good luck, which will turn the tide of the battle.
Just outside the city, thousands of reinforcements led by General Pakenham intend to overwhelm the Americans with sheer numbers and take advantage of a glaring weakness in their defense.
Pakenham's plan is aggressive, but it's too complicated. He's got too many columns moving forward, and everything has got to be timed to perfection.
In the pre-dawn mist of January 8th, 1815, the British begin their advance. From the start, problems plague Pakenham's troops. The muddy riverbanks slow the launching of the attack force. Once in the water, the swift current sends some boats too far downstream before they can reach the west bank. By the time they make it across the river, it will be too late to effect the battle. Elsewhere, the 44th Regiment, part of the main assault force, blunders.
The primary assault column is on the march, and the regiment that's supposed to carry the scaling ladders have forgotten them. They've left them behind. When they go back to get them, the column's already on the move.
At sunrise, the mist clears, exposing the oncoming British force, rocket fire lighting their way.
Press your lines.
Jackson calls to his men.
They are near enough now, gentlemen. You may fire when ready.
A Kentucky rifleman remembers how his fellow defenders responded to Old Hickory's orders.
Steady, boys. Hold your fire. Take aim! Fire!
Then the heavy iron cannon, and some thousands of small arms joined in and made the ground shake under our feet. As soon as the firing began, Captain Patterson came running along. He shouted, "Shoot low, boys! Shoot low! Rake 'em!"
The British Army has lost its commander.
In just 20 minutes, the British High Command has been obliterated. The survivors realize they will never reach New Orleans and halt the attack. Improbably, Old Hickory's ragtag army has just trounced the world's best fighting force in little more than 2 hours. News of the victory spreads a euphoric nationalism throughout the country. But not everyone is celebrating. Those who oppose the war are about to pay dearly. The Federalist delegates who had pushed for secession are labeled as traitors. But for Andrew Jackson, the savior of New Orleans, his heroic exploits catapult him from the battlefield to the White House as the nation's 7th president in 1829. His election confirms the coming of age of a new America, forged by men who shaped the times through which they passed.
The War of 1812 shouldn't be forgotten, because that's a turning point in the development of American democracy, American government, the American sense of who we are. It was the one moment that we needed psychologically to prove that we had a right to exist as an independent and free nation. And we did it at that time. After the War of 1812, we proved we were here to stay. And that's why I think it should be remembered by all Americans today.
History remembers the War of 1812 as the Forgotten War. It is a story of courage, endurance, and a little bit of luck. Forged by fire, united by will, a young nation defied the odds and won.
Awesome. All right. And so the video says it really well. You know, while we're not talking much about the details of the War of 1812, I think the theme of the war is really where we can focus here. This idea of not just with the Battle of New Orleans, but in general of America having to reprove. Right? We did this 8-year war with the American Revolution, and now we're being asked to reprove, fighting against the same enemy, that we actually are here to stay, and we are capable of defending ourselves, and we are capable of growing. And through the War of 1812, we get almost the next generation of leaders stepping up. A lot of those founding fathers are getting older and starting to do other things and moving on, and we have this new group stepping up and taking these leadership roles, and they'll continue to do that going forward. So right at the end there, they referenced this time immediately after the War of 1812, and we're going to see a major change in America. As the war is breaking out, like I said before, the war was really divided, right? There were a lot of people that were against the war. There's a specific group of Federalists in New England that actually publicly discussed actually leaving the country, seceding and leaving the nation, just like the South is going to do, 50 years after this, over this idea of going to war with England, this idea that, you know what, this is going to be really bad for us, maybe we should just form our own country. So seceding, breaking away from. Now they ended up not doing that, and they stuck with it, but when we win the war, they are going to play a heavy political toll for sure. And after that Treaty of Ghent, and after the victory of New Orleans, what we see with the Federalist Party is that people look at that talk of leaving the country and they think that's super unpatriotic, and it's going to basically destroy that Federalist Party. So we talked about the Federalists as being one of our first real political parties. Well, here they are, now gone. That next election, they don't even really run a presidential candidate because they just don't have enough support. And so with that, we're going to enter this era called the Era of Good Feelings, it was a period of about 10 or so years, maybe 8 years, one or two presidential elections, where there really is only one political party. The Democratic Republicans is what they called themselves at the time, both of our parties together in one name. Things aren't perfect, right? Even when you have full control of the government, sometimes it's harder to get things done than you think. But this era of good feelings was kind of this sugar-coated idea that everything should be perfect because we have everybody believing the same thing, should be able to pass through pretty quickly. But it wasn't quite that. So this last piece today is going to just be that nice transition into the next war that we're coming up next, the Civil War.
In 1816, James Monroe of the Democratic Republican Party was elected president almost unanimously. For the first time, the opposing Federalist Party had not nominated a candidate for the presidency. The Federalists had been losing popularity for several years, ever since they opposed America's entry in the War of 1812. Monroe's triumph signaled their final collapse.
The Federalists never again took the White House, and they began declining. And after the War of 1812, the Federalist Party essentially disappeared. And for a brief period known as the Era of Good Feelings, there was only one party, and therefore there was no great political contest.
Monroe took advantage of this new spirit of nonpartisan harmony, choosing men from both the Democratic Republican and the Federalist parties to be in his cabinet. For Secretary of State, he chose John Quincy Adams, a member of the Federalist Party, not Monroe's party. Adams was responsible for the major diplomatic successes of Monroe's administration, the acquisition of Florida from Spain, and the famous Monroe Doctrine. It was even a newspaper from traditionally Federalist New England that gave the period its famous name.
The Era of Good Feelings, the phrase actually comes from a Boston newspaper. James Monroe goes for a trip up to Boston, and as he enters Boston, a newspaper heralds his arrival with a headline that says, "The Era of Good Feelings." Historians have argued a bit. Some have said that the Era of Good Feelings arrived with Monroe and left with Monroe. It ends for a variety of reasons. Partially it ends because of the Panic of 1819, when the United States experiences this rather massive economic panic that ends the economic boom that had begun in the aftermath of the War of 1812. But the Era of Good Feelings also dwindles because of the rise of the Second American Party system, which develops in the early 1820s.
All right. So that Era of Good Feelings, we're going to reference that again as we look at the decades building up to the Revolution. Really, that's going to start in 1820 is kind of where we're going to start looking at the Civil War, where those political parties kind of come back together again. All right, folks, that should be it for today. We've taken you through really two fights for revolution here, both the original Revolutionary War and then that War of 1812. At this point, your note sheet should be completed. Make sure you fill out all of those pink sections before you drop that in the Dropbox for today. Now, you do have a test tomorrow, so keep that in mind as well. It will be open note, right? It will be timed, so very similar to what you've had in the past. So make sure you're organized, make sure you have your notes organized, so you're ready to go for that. All right, guys, thank you so much. Hope you're having a great day at home. Rest up, and we'll see you tomorrow. Bye-bye.